at today is the osteology of the upper limb. Specifically, we're going to look at the vertebral column. The first thing we do with the models, the first thing we do with any models, is to put them into anatomical position. What I have laying down is from superior to inferior, the smaller vertebrae on top to the larger ones on the bottom. Anterior are going to be the bodies, which are laying down on the table. And posterior are the spines, which are in the back here. This is anatomical position. Next, we're going to look at the different regions of the vertebrae. We have a total of 31 vertebrae. We have 7 in the cervical region. Cervical means neck. We have 12 in the thoracic region, with 1 for each rib. We have 5 in the lumbar region. This is the lower back. We have in the sacrum 5 fused vertebrae, and we have 1 coccyx or coccygeal vertebrae. The coccyx is made of 4 vertebrae that are fused together, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So an easy mnemonic for remembering this is you have breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and supper at 5. That's the number of the vertebrae you have in each region. We're going to look first at the features that are common to all vertebrae. Then later we're going to look at features which distinguish vertebrae at each level. You should be able to pull up a vertebrae and know immediately if you're looking at a thoracic, lumbar, or cervical vertebrae. What I'm holding in my hand is a typical vertebrae. The typical vertebrae consists of a body, which is the main portion here, the pedicle, this region which separates the body from the transverse process. We have 2 transverse processes, 1 on each side. The lamina, which separates the transverse processes from the spinous process, and we have in the back a single spinous process. In the center, we have the vertebral foramen. This is for the passage of the spinal cord. And if we look at several vertebrae together, come down here, if we put a couple of them together, we notice an intervertebral foramen. Inter means between, so this is the foramen that is formed between 2 vertebrae. What we notice when we put them together is they articulate very nicely, the bodies line up. We also have a flat spot here. This is the inferior articular facet, which is going to articulate with a corresponding flat spot. That is our superior articular facet. Again, we have an inferior articular facet on the bottom and a superior articular facet on top. If we pick up a vertebrae, this is typical of the cervical region. You'll notice that we have a very small body here. We have 2 processes on the side. These are our transverse processes. And we have a process in the back that I talked about a minute ago. This is the spinous process. We're going to look at typical thoracic vertebrae. You'll notice that the body is much larger on this one. This is the mid-size. We have 2 transverse processes. A process is singular, processes is plural. We have a single spinous process in the back. And then finally we have our lumbar vertebrae. The body here is huge as compared to the rest of the body, rest of the column. We have again transverse process on the side, 2 transverse processes, and 1 in the back is our spinous process. Okay. So this is the same on all of our vertebrae. You'll notice too we have a hole right down the center. This is the vertebral foramen. This is for the transmission of the spinal cord. So we will see that here, here, and here at every level. Here's another look of the vertebral column together. You see we have the smaller bodies on the top, the mid-range bodies in the cervical region, and the larger bodies of the lumbar region. If we turn this around, this is anterior. We're going to look at the back. These are the spinous processes that I mentioned before. You see how they form the spine. These are the bumps that you can feel in your body. And of course on the sides, these would be our transverse processes. And do you remember I mentioned the intervertebral foramen? Here you can see where I have the superior articular facet articulating with the inferior articular facet above it. That gives us this hole. That's our intervertebral foramen. And here's our spinal nerve exiting. Then if we look up here in the cervical region, do you remember I said that one of the distinguishing features of the cervical vertebrae was the transverse foramen? Here are transverse processes on the side, and you can see what goes through the transverse foramen is our vertebral artery. The vertebral artery only goes through C1 through C6 or sometimes C7, but it never goes through the thoracic vertebrae. So the only place you will find these transverse foramen is on cervical vertebrae. Let's take a minute to look at some differences among vertebrae at different levels. Here we have our cervical vertebrae. Remember, there were 7 cervical vertebrae. C1 and C2 and C7 are very distinctive. C1 has no body. Remember, it had the anterior and posterior tubercles instead. C2 is different. It has the dens, which is a unique feature. And C7, vertebrae prominence, it has a huge spinous process. Within the cervical region, one thing we find are transverse foramen. Recall these are for the transmission of the vertebral artery. You will only find these on C1 through C6 or sometimes C7. When we have the bodies are very, very small. And the reason for this is we're only supporting the weight of the head, so we need very small bodies. If we look on the back, the spinous processes are sometimes bifid, not always, but sometimes. The only place you will find this bifurcation or split is on cervical vertebrae. So these are some key characteristics that you may find in cervical vertebrae. Let's go down and look at our thoracic vertebrae. One of the things you will notice here is that our spinous processes tend to be angular and pointed downward. This is a very common characteristic. Another thing to note is what we have articulating with the vertebrae here at the thoracic region that we don't have anywhere else is the rib. So we will need places for the rib to articulate. If you look on the vertebrae, you will find flat spots on the body, 2 flat spots, little demifacets, and a flat spot on the transverse process. This is where the rib is going to articulate. The rib, the tubercle of the rib is going to fit on the transverse process, and on the head we have 2 flat spots. The lower one is going to articulate to the body at the same level, then the other one is going to articulate with the body above it. So each rib has 3 articulation points. The transverse process and the body at the same level, and then the body at the level above it. We also have mid-sized bodies in this region as compared to cervical or lumbar. When we come down here on the lumbar vertebrae, we notice we have huge bodies, and the reason the bodies are so big is we're not supporting not just the head and the thorax, but also the abdomen, the entire upper body. We also notice that the spinous process is square and hatchet-like. We do not have transverse foramina, and we do not have articulation sites for ribs. Those are some of the major differences that we can see on the vertebrae at different levels. What we have here are C1 atlas and C2 axis. When we look at them together like this, we're seeing them articulated. This is C1 on top, C2 on bottom. Even if we put them out of anatomical position, this is still C2 and this is still C1. I want to take a look at both of these individually so you can see the major differences and landmarks. So let's look at this other set, C1 and C2. C1 is called atlas because what articulates here with these superior articular facets are the occipital condyles of the skull. This is a bony articulation we have with the skull. So the weight of the entire skull is resting on this small bone. That's why it's called atlas. Atlas is holding up the world, if you remember your literature. The interesting thing about C1 atlas is it does not have a body. You'll notice the body here is missing. Instead, we have an anterior tubercle. We also don't have a spinous process. Instead, we have a posterior tubercle. Like other cervical vertebrae, we have our transverse foramen on either side. And like other vertebrae, we have this large vertebral foramen going down the middle. We have our superior articular facets, and on the bottom, our inferior articular facets. C1 articulates with C2. You'll notice C2 has a very large dens or odontoid process. This was embryologically the body of C1, which migrated down onto C2. So you can always spot C2 by the presence of the dens or odontoid process. So C2 is called axis because when C1 sits on it, C2 can rotate on its axis. So see how it's twisting here? We have a ligament that goes across and holds this in place and allows it to rotate on its axis. When you identify C1 and C2, you need to identify them by both name and number. C1 atlas, C2 axis.